Yes, thank you very much. I also would like to thank the organizers and the Academy for really having put this wonderful program. I changed the title a little bit. Topic is still the same. I thought I'd focus on hallucination engineering using techniques like robotics and virtual reality to induce hallucinatory states. I think that will fit nicely with David's talk from just before, and then apply this in Parkinson's disease in something that we refer to as cognitive neuroprosthesis, so prosthesis for the cognitive mind. It's a new topic, so for the last 5-6 years, we've gotten more interested in Parkinson's disease. I actually come from epilepsy research and invasive recordings there. And of course, is a textbook slide about Parkinson's disease really being an amazing example of what neuroscience is able to achieve. It started, of course, with a movement disorder description, bradykinesia, rigidity, tremor, and then over several decades of the last century, the determination of the dopaminergic system, the striatal dopamine depletion, dopamine replacement therapy. These are major success stories in neurology, in clinical neurology. There are animal models that we referred to yesterday, and deep brain stimulation. So in neurotechnology, we've just heard this morning also about initially developed from the work initially in Grenoble to be a treatment for movement disorder. But, and Parkinson's disease is still a movement disorder. When I trained in neurology, I did not look at cognitive functions in Parkinson patients, but as this slide very nicely shows, and this is the bottom part of the image, movement disorder starts at around, I think there's a time axis missing, but whether you time in years, that's more or less the movement onset. The diagnosis is made, and that's how the onset of Parkinson's disease is defined. But you see that in the lighter green area below the surface of the y-axis, of the x-axis, you see a range of non-motor symptoms. Actually, there are more non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease than there are motor symptoms. There is sleep-related disorders, there's constipation, depression, anxiety, hyposmia, and the two parts that I'm interested in, hallucinations, actually start very early, as well as mild, and later on quite massive cognitive therapy. And of course, whereas dopamine replacement therapy and DBS work very well for movement symptoms, they do not work for hallucinations. Actually, they can exacerbate them, and they do not work for the cognitive deficits. And if we want to come up eventually with neuroprotective therapies, we need to have a very early diagnosis. And as you can see on that slide as well, these non-motor symptoms can sometimes start 10 to 15 years earlier. So that's, I think, our main motivation to be interested in them, apart that also as a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm interested in hallucinations and alterations of consciousness. So what kind of hallucinations do have Parkinson patients? They're also extremely interesting. They're very complex hallucinations. They can be typically visual hallucinations late in the disease. So patients would be seeing human figures or animals, very rarely non-animate objects. The hallucination that I'm particularly interested in is an early hallucination. It's called a presence hallucination, and it happens really in the first couple of years surrounding the first motor symptoms. So 50%, that's a number. So 1 out of 2 Parkinson patients will suffer from hallucinations, including visual or presence hallucinations. And they're indicative. If you have, as a Parkinson patient, hallucinations, it's indicative of later developing cognitive deficit, particularly frontal lobe deficit. So presence hallucination, which is a hallucinatory perception that another person is close by. I do not see that person, I do not hear that person present, but I feel there's somebody behind me. So as if there were somebody sitting just behind me in the empty chair. And it's so convincing that patients often have to look around. So here are 3 examples to highlight the point how stereotypical these hallucinations can be.
J'ai ce sentiment de présence. Quelqu'un derrière moi. La première fois, mais c'était vraiment flagrant. J'en ai eu froid dans le dos. C'est-à-dire de sentir quelque chose au-dessus de l'épaule gauche, particulièrement gauche.
J'étais là, et puis tout à coup j'ai senti une présence, puis j'ai tourné la tête et je me suis...
Toujours, et toujours quand vous êtes assis ou aussi dans la position debout?
Non, en position debout aussi.
Et quand vous marchez, qu'est-ce qui se passe? La présence va disparaître ou elle va marcher, se déplacer avec vous?
Non, en règle générale, elle se déplace avec moi. Je la sens toujours à côté de moi. Je la vois pas, mais je la sens.
And here the most striking example, I find.
C'est mon duvet qui est parce qu'il y a un lit d'un mètre 20. Il y a un duvet qui est un petit peu roulé, et je fais comme ça parce que j'ai l'impression qu'il y a mon mari qui est là, ou bien l'autre jour c'était ma mère. Et alors je fais, mais je suis obligée de bien mettre le doigt pour être sûre qu'il n'y a pas quelqu'un. Je sais bien qu'il n'y a pas quelqu'un, mais c'est quand même incroyable qu'il faille que je vérifie.
So this last patient, I don't know if you caught it. It was so she clearly realizes that these are misperceptions, hallucinations, but in the moment they are so convincing that she has to check in her bed, poke to the covers to make sure that her dead husband, who died 20 years ago, is not lying next to her. So it's highly convincing, strong, in the moment, full-blown hallucination. Of course, a minute later, 2 minutes later, the patient, of course, realizes that he or she are wrong. But it's a very convincing feeling that really somebody is visiting and is with. The question was, how can we study those? Ideally, we wanted to induce them. Hallucination engineering would like to have a model that you can induce such hallucinations experimentally, ideally in healthy subjects, and later on also in patients. I'll be brief on this. For time reasons, together with Masayuki Hara, we developed a robotic stimulation device, which was based first on data that you see on the left by Larry Weisskranz, who had worked, and Sarah Jane Blakemore and Chris Frith, using sensory prediction models that certain kind of tactile sensations cannot be predicted and leads to illusory and hallucinatory misperceptions. Ticklishness sensations, for example, can be calibrated. And for us in particular, it was a stimulation case like what Joseph presented yesterday. So we stimulated the temporal cortex and induced a self-related distortion or alterated self-related mechanisms that led to this presence hallucination. But here the presence hallucination was exactly in an epileptic patient, like in the Parkinson patients, but induced for 2-second long periods of stimulation. Of course, an ideal case of hallucination engineering, you have the right area, you stimulate. And what we were able to see is that when we changed the position of the patient, also the position of the presence changed. When the patient was moving, when the presence was moving, when the patient was sitting, also the presence was sitting, which you can see here in the darkish image after the patient drawn in white. But what we developed based on this, and this is what I want to mostly focus on, is shown in the next video, that we had a two-robotic system measuring movements, as you see here in the right hand, which is inserted into the front robot. This measures and can measure the force, the movement, and of course a touch cue, and then a second robot can mimic those movements and then apply them at a different body part. Very much based on those scenarios that I have been gone over too briefly that I indicated on the left. And when you do a synchronous stimulation, the patient feels to be touching him or herself or the subject, but when there is a mismatch, meaning that the poking in the back is delayed in time compared to what the subject is doing in the front, we not only get a passivity sensation, a loss of agency, but our healthy subjects, as I show you on the next slide, also reported that there was somebody standing beside them, behind them actually doing the poking. So as if the robot is applying the stroking, but is perceived as a person. So you see this here in the video. So what you see there is, first of all, self-touch. So in the synchronous condition, meaning the front robot is in synchronous mode with the back robot, people have the impression to touch themselves. Self-touch in the white condition is high, and in the dark condition, the asynchronous condition, this is decreased. However, the passivity symptom touched by somebody else is increased, and in the dark condition, and so in the feeling of a presence, so the presence hallucination condition also leads to an increase. So that's subjective rating. So we can quantify across these conditions, and we have tested a lot more conditions, the induction, experimentally induced induction of this presence hallucination, again, in completely healthy, naive subjects. And then there are several behavioral markers that we can also measure in association. So we're not only inducing hallucinations, we're also linking this robotic system to behavioral psychophysical testing. And we have done also several other tests. I won't have time to go into details here in actually almost 300, 400 subjects on this, that if we change the feedback location, so if instead of the back touch, the second robot will be touching another body part, the hand, this illusion also breaks down. And as you can imagine, as the delay is increased from synchronous 0 milliseconds delay between the two robots to higher delays, the present sensation ratings go up. So what did we find in Parkinson patients? So you see again, the system is done here in the sitting position to be comfortable for the patients. They were able to do this completely normally. But what we observed is that there's two groups of Parkinson patients that are indicated here. There's a red group of Parkinson patients, and they are the 50% who have symptomatic presence hallucinations. And there's a Parkinson's control group, which is shown in blue, PD minus. And this is the sensitivity, a group effect independently of the stroking synchrony. And you can see that there is a 6-fold increase, something rarely seen if you have two patient groups, a 6-fold increase in sensitivity to this robotic system. So we had a small but significant effect in healthy subjects, young healthy subjects. If we now go to Parkinson patients who suffer from this more aggressive form of Parkinson's disease associated with clinical hallucinations, they're extremely sensitive to our system. That's the red group. And you see that also in the second study where we added several delays. You again see this massive offset of that group, and then you see that they're much more sensitive to the delay. The advantage of the robotic system is the plot on the right, is that we can also, or we quantify all the movements that patients have carried out, because you could argue maybe this difference in sensitivity is related to differences in how they do the poking movements, and this is over 2 hours of experiments, but you see on the overlay, and we have many other data that they are comparable in this sense. So we have a hallucination induction task, pretty much like the cardiac stress test in cardiology, where we can really push people and test out their limits, whether they are likely to have hallucinations or not. We're also very proud in the hallucination engineering sense that we made our robot MRI compatible. This was again Masayuki Hara. So we replaced the scanner bed, which became the robotic device, and then he built this robot in the scanner out of wood and plastic and other materials to make it in there. And it's Eva's work then, who on the top left, you see the activity when people, again, healthy subjects, experience the presence hallucination in the scanner, a bit weaker than what I've showed you before, but still across these conditions, and you can map out using fMRI this network. We wanted to overlap and compare this red network in healthy subjects with presence hallucinations in patients, neurological patients, not patients suffering from Parkinson's disease, that's shown in the green areas, and then we overlap those symptomatic presence hallucination with network, with a healthy subject network, and that's what you see on the right, and we get 3 areas on the left, and we projected them also over on the left side. It's a bilateral network consisting of posterior MTG or SDS area, the inferior frontal gyrus, and the premotor cortex. Our question then was to bring this back to Parkinson's disease. Would patients, now this is a new group of Parkinson patients tested with friends and colleagues from Barcelona, Jaime Kulisevsky and Javier Paganavaraga, and we were interested in now, if we have resting state functional connectivity, we have our presence hallucination network, would patients with hallucinations show a disruption of this network? And this is what I show you here. There's one in the left hemisphere, a frontotemporal connectivity was decreased. So the group of Parkinson patients, the color code is the same. So the red group is, I can hardly see it from here, is the one with presence hallucinations. So you see this decrease in functional connectivity between these two networks. And interestingly, for later work, I won't have much data on this at the moment, but our end goal really is to have an approach also to cognitive decline in Parkinson patients. The more this red connectivity is decreased, the higher is your cognitive decline. And it's important that all these patients are still normal, so they don't even have a mild cognitive impairment. These are very, very early Parkinson patients, but we can detect with this neural and this robotic marker, we can detect them and distinguish them quite nicely from this non-hallucinating Parkinson. So this is really, let's say, a more full-scale model of what we would like to do in hallucination engineering. Now we're linking, and this is work by Louis Albert, unpublished work, where we're linking virtual reality with the robotic procedure. And our idea here was, it was actually suggested by a reviewer of one of our earlier papers, is in order to quantify whether how real this sensation is, and to have a repeated measure. If you have this presence hallucination and you feel an invisible presence there, if you would see other people at the same time, like looking at you in this room right now, and let's say there are 30 of us here, would I have a tendency to, if I have to estimate how many of us are here, to say 31 or 32? Would the brain be pushed just because you feel somebody there to overestimate? So this is a numerosity, a task not for dots and mathematical cognition so much, but for social component of this. So for example, our subjects would be doing the robot task and would be looking at a scene like this. This is actually a Louis programmed, so this the virtual reconstruction of the actual experimental room. And there were 8 people in there, and you see 6 people here. And so we induce our hallucination, and we do a numerosity task. And this is a very long, very boring experiment to do this over and over and over. But I think in order to stand this hallucinatory process, I think very important. There's other parts of virtual reality which are very interesting in this way of kind of disconnecting you from reality and immersing you really in the experiment. So here are the data that Louis acquired. You can see in the middle of this, you see the numerosities marked 5, 6, 7, or 8. Then there's a dashed line. So we show you 6 humans. And what you can see is that in those 2 conditions, really a bit too small to see, there's always an overestimate. So our healthy subjects always have a tendency to see more people, but this tendency is increased for 6, 7, and 8 numerosities, specifically in the asynchronous condition, which is the darker blue condition, which you see there somehow always a little bit higher on the left and lower on the right. So it's a really consistent effect. What the patient is feeling at home, those 3 examples, or what we induce experimentally in these healthy subjects here, is associated with a visual overestimation of people, and we can measure this very nicely, and if this leads to a main effect. So in the asynchronous, what is shown on the left, the main result is really that independent of how many people show in the room, people have overestimation, but only in the condition when they hallucinate another person in the room. This is not related to reaction time differences, and one of the other reasons why we went into this numerosity paradigm is that we can then change and change the human stimuli with a non-human stimulus, and can test, is it human specific, what the hallucination content really is. And what you can see here on the right side is that there's still overestimation, but it's completely unrelated to whether we induce a hallucination. And then I think I have to speed up. Louis also developed an online version of this test and tested over almost 200 Parkinson patients online at home. He developed a home-based, tablet-based test for this. And here we, of course, could not bring the robotic device to 170 homes of these patients, but those patients who have symptomatic hallucinations, disease-related hallucinations at home, they have a larger, again, numerosity overestimation bias than those patients who don't. So we have really a nice way to translate these findings. So hallucination engineering, or maybe technodelic, something we should discuss with respect to psychedelics, is that there are, of course, many other techniques like brain stimulation, invasive brain stimulation, other ones. But I think it's important to have these fine-grained, titrated states of hallucinatory states in order to try to understand them and really bring them to a cognitive neuroscience lab. Robotics will be important. I think an integration with pharmacological manipulations would be fascinating. Microdose of psilocybin associated and combined with our task. And also virtual reality, I think, will play an important role. Just very briefly here, a video how we link it to meditation approach. So you see a subject in the room. There is a virtual experimenter who will explain you the experiment. And you see it's a virtual reconstruction first of our room, but then we can take patients and subjects, of course, to different environments like the forest here. We can even induce out-of-body experience like scenarios. I think VR is really going to be a powerful tool in this. And of course, I hope I have convinced you in these first data that minor hallucinations or hallucinations normally have been described early, so this presence hallucination, but what our data show is that we don't have to wait until a patient reports the hallucination. We can detect their sensitivity, we can push them to have these hallucinations, and together with sleep disorders and other non-motor symptoms this could be, and that's something we pursue, a very quantitative early marker in terms of behavior, but also neural markers. And something we're pursuing is non-invasive brain stimulation at the moment in order to interfere with those systems, not yet, of course, in terms of medical research, but in terms of further understanding the system. Back to Parkinson's disease and deep brain stimulation, Helen has presented amazing work in depression, and of course the technique has been developed first in Parkinson's disease. Beta oscillations at the subthalamic nucleus are one neural marker again that is pushed very strongly towards closed-loop DBS systems at the moment. They're not yet available, but I think it will not last very long. So the idea is that if you detect a beta oscillation, to suppress this beta oscillation by DBS, and this improves motor symptoms. Several studies from Brown, Oxford, but also from the Berlin group have shown very nice results. So you see this large peak in the grayish area under the beta oscillations in the off state, and then on medication or with DBS stimulation on this suppressed and also suppresses motor function. So we are very interested in developing a similar system, moving on to cognitive neuroprosthetics for alleviation of hallucinations and also cognitive decline. And this is work that we started with Ali Rezai at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute in West Virginia. It's going on now for several years. We're interested in single unit recordings in awake humans during implantation, but just on this one slide, some very recent data unpublished, where we brought also our tool to this neurosurgical setting, because if you want to treat and optimize DBS for hallucination therapy in this context, you would have to have a measurement before and after implantation to see where's the right spot to alleviate those. And you also need to find, so that's one advantage, you also need to find and detect which kind of brain oscillation is related to them. So on the far right, I show you that beta oscillations are not related to our robotic manipulation. But here, so what I show you on the left is these are recordings from the subthalamic nucleus of a group of 15 patients who had, most of them had bilateral implants in order to alleviate motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And we use those same electrodes to record LFPs. And if you record those LFPs and you again record them while patients in this case are actuating our robotic system, you see again the red asynchronous condition and the blue synchronous condition. This is a single patient data that I show you. There is in the theta to alpha band, not in the beta band, there is a suppression, or in this case, an enhancement of the alpha power in the asynchronous hallucination-inducing condition. And if we do this for all patients that we have with the bilateral implants, you see this is a general effect that we can observe in all patients. For time reasons, maybe I skipped the part in the middle, but we also have surface EEG data in the same patient, again undergoing this robotic stimulation to see whether there's a particular frequency, what we believe to be the alpha theta band driving these hallucinatory changes at the level of the subthalamic nucleus, and analysis at the level of the surface electrodes is ongoing in these same patients. This is a completely different study where we actually have independent evidence that cognitive decline and presence hallucinations in a very large sample of 75 patients is also indicative, particularly in frontal regions, of cognitive decline and presence hallucinations. But our main goal is to go deeper and access data at the level of the subthalamic nucleus to push neuroprosthetics in this direction, to have a non-invasive potential cognitive neuroprosthetic treatment. Yeah, I could end my presentation here, but together with Marcello Jenka and given the topic of our conference here, we have thought and participated at several meetings, also together with Rafa Juste, of course, who was, I think, at all of these meetings as well. And so Marcello has been interested in neuroethics for a long time. And while we were discussing around these meetings, we think that something like experimental neuroethics would be important to establish as a field. I think it's completely, in our opinion, it is lacking. So it would be a method to gather experimental evidence on the ethical, legal impact on neurotechnologies directly in experiments. Evidence-based is a key form. So for the moment, we have philosophical analysis, empirical social science method, and secondary research like meta-analysis and reviews. So with Marcello and I think that one should develop experimental neuroethics, so experiments directed to ethical challenges in many of our experiments that we're doing here, but to target them head-on by experiments. So one example is again work with Ali Rezai, where something similar we have started. It was sort of a side project. Ali Rezai and his team
brain are recorded, analyzed within microseconds, and translated into signals that allow an external sleeve to be able to move his hands. He has gone from small movement in his fingers to much more sophisticated and progressive movements.
For me, it's not about walking. What if I can regain use of my hands and be more independent?
So I stop it here. So we had an M1 implant. The main experiments to improve and develop sophisticated brain-computer interface were finished. Ian, the patient that you've seen, was a 20-year-old patient, and he was tetraplegic without the BMI system, but because of the BMI system, you've seen very briefly in the video the kind of movements he was able to do. So what we were interested in was a very simple question. What does it feel like to control the brain-computer interface? And what happens if we don't improve it? But what happens if we impair his brain-computer interface? Is he able to detect this? These classifier changes that we do? And I get a strong note, so I will pass on. So so there was a Utah array implanted, and we manipulated his sense of agency in two ways by changing visual feedback. So he learned how to open and close the hand, and at some conditions he would open the hand with a brain-computer interface driven command, but we would not show him an open hand, we would show him a closed hand. So we exposed him, although the BMI decoder correctly detected the signal, we gave him a different kind of feedback, a wrong feedback, as if we were doing a brain hacking. And we wanted to see whether he detects this. He detects this like we would detect, or like healthy subjects detect these conflicts. He was particularly sensitive to sensory motor conflicts. And then there is a lot of neural data that an area not necessarily involved in the sense of agency, the primary motor cortex, does actually reflect and distinguish between these signals. The most important slide is here, that also the sense of agency changes neural activity. So this is single unit activity and multi-unit activity with decoded with a Utah implant. So we can have differences depending on the sense of agency in a BMI system, but also the classifier. So how good the BMI decoder is able to work is changed by these subjective states. And I think I stop here. There's yet another experiment where we also performed the Libet paradigm and intentional binding, again with that same setup. And I think it's a step into what experimental neuroethics would look like, that you're not just speculating afterwards what a patient could have behaved like in experience, but to test it really head on. Thank you.